Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 256, I chat with film director and SMPTE Standards Director Howard Lukk about new filmmaking technologies. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded May 21st, 2015. Episode 256, New Filmmaking Technologies. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week's guest geek is Howard Lukk, SMPTE Standards Director, and also a film director in his own right. We're going to be talking about lots of stuff around those particular activities. Hey, Howard, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. It should be fun.
It should be great fun. In fact, Howard is in the middle of a couple of big projects that we're going to talk about, but we managed to find a little window of time for him to come on the show, and I'm really happy about that. And I want to thank SMPTE also, the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, for their help in arranging to have Howard on the show today. They have been very kind to me in helping to find people to come on the show and talk about various things, and this is a prime example of that, as you shall soon see. Now, those who are watching live at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room there or at irc.twit.tv can post questions for Howard as we go, and I will pass along as many as I can.
And
now,
I will try to answer as many as I can.
And Howard will try to answer as many as he can, yes. And Howard's a very...
Yeah, I love your title, Geeks. I feel like I am a geek and a self-titled uber geek, so I'm glad to be on a geek show. Geeks will rule the earth.
Yes, we will. No doubt about it. Well, that's great. I'm so glad to know that you consider yourself a geek. Most of the guests here do, but you embrace it. You embrace your geekdom, and I really appreciate that.
That's right.
Now, Howard, you are currently an independent film director and director also of the SMPTE Standards Committee, or standards effort, I should say, which is a large part of what SMPTE does. But you worked at Disney for, what, 10 years?
Yeah, I did. I was fortunate enough to be hired by Disney shortly after I finished working with the digital cinema initiatives on digital cinema specs. And part of that time, I actually got to work a year and a half up at Pixar, which was the best time of my life ever, I think.
Oh, man, that must have been amazing. That was up in Emeryville?
Oh, yeah. It was like being a kid in the candy store, you know, up in Emeryville. So I worked there during the Toy Story 3 timeframe. For about a year and a half in the image mastering department, and with the Avengers, Go Avengers. They're the AV engineers that take care of all of the systems as far as audio and visual stuff goes at Pixar. So it was a wonderful experience, and I miss the folks there terribly, and I wish them well with Inside Out that's coming up. It's a wonderful film. I can't wait to see it. So,
oh man, it just looks great to me. I've seen the previews and trailers and such, and it's the second movie actually to come out to be released to the public in high dynamic range, which it's really something. It's the first animated movie. The very first movie to come out is Tomorrowland, which is due to be released tomorrow. Wow. And have you seen it yet in high dynamic range?
I have not seen it. I was working at Disney when they were getting up on the preparations to talk about the shooting. We did a bunch of tests at that time, but I had left Disney about around this time last year, so was not a part of the final. And have not seen it, and I'm really excited to see it. It looks like a fantastic film. It's a great story. And it's in HDR in some special locations. So I know, I think you had a chance to maybe get a glimpse at that.
I did. I actually saw the whole movie in a preview screening last Tuesday. Dolby was kind enough to invite me to one of the theaters that has the high dynamic range HDR capability, which is the El Capitan in Hollywood, California. It's one of only 4 theaters in the country that have the capability to reproduce high dynamic range from the projectors which are called Dolby Vision projectors, co-developed by Christie. And there were supposed to be two in LA. One was the El Capitan in Hollywood, and the other was the AMC Burbank 16 in Burbank. But I just learned that there's been some delay in the implementation or the installation of the Dolby Vision projectors in the Burbank location. So that's not going to be ready apparently for the opening tomorrow. But if you're in LA, definitely go to the El Capitan, if you can, in Hollywood to see it. And I've got to tell you, in high dynamic range, it's stunning, absolutely stunning, like easily the best cinematic image I've ever seen.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
I'm very... I'm very jealous that you got to go see it already, and I haven't seen it yet. So I'm gonna try to get out there and buy some tickets and get down there and take a look. But this I think is probably the most exciting thing to the creative community that's come along in quite some time. I know we've all been talking about resolution and more pixels, but as Pat Griffiths from Dolby puts it, we're looking for better pixels, and high dynamic range really works on trying to expand that contrast from the blackest black to the whitest whites and get back to, kind of where we were with Vision Premiere film in its heyday, although there wasn't much left or much distributed on Vision Premiere. But this is the kind of thing that we're chasing after. And so I'm glad to see that it really, really worked and worked well with the story as well, too.
Yeah, it really did. Another really good thing about Tomorrowland is that it's in 2D. It's not in 3D. Which, I myself am a fan of 3D, generally speaking. I like it. You don't need it for this movie, for one thing. The high dynamic range just gives you a sense of depth that I have never seen before in a 2D image, but it's really fantastic. But the problem with 3D on these laser illuminated projectors, which the Dolby Vision projectors are, IMAX as well, are these glasses, these color separation glasses, as they're called. And what they do for anyone who wears prescription glasses, like me, and I think you get these internal reflections between the outer surface of your prescription glasses and the inner surface of these 3D glasses, which are very reflective. Very distracting to me. So I was super happy to know that this was in 2D, and you can see the high dynamic range in all of its glory. I mean, it had black letterbox bars. The screen is at the El Cap is 1.8 to 1 aspect ratio, and the movie is 2.2.
Yeah,
so
and
there's
it's a really large screen as well, too. So it takes a lot of light to really light up that screen. We've done tests there in the past, and that's an enormous. I mean, the Chinese is the only one that's bigger that I know of in town.
It's about 4 times the area of the El Cap, but the El Cap is very big. It's true, 45 feet wide.
Right.
The other really interesting thing that I thought you should know, if you don't already, is that, as you do know, I'm sure, movies are graded now, and projectors are set up to show a peak brightness on the screen of 16 foot Lamberts in what's called open gate, right? So no film in the projector. Of course, there are very few film projectors anymore, but anyway, they're looking for 16 foot Lamberts, which is a measure of brightness off the screen. Tomorrowland was mastered, graded, and projected at 31 foot Lamberts.
Yeah, so that is really close to the standard that we use for home television at this moment. So you're grading
flat
up to
panels, exactly.
Exactly, on a flat panel. I mean, this is on a big screen, so you imagine the light and the intensity and the contrast you can get off of that large screen. So the other thing that people don't really realize either is that as you increase the dynamic range, that contrast, it actually makes the picture sharper. Because resolution and contrast are tightly coupled together. You can't separate the two. And so by increasing the contrast, it actually makes it look like it's a sharper picture. I don't know if you noticed that during the screening or not, if it seemed like it was really good, solid, sharp, and
absolutely. It looked very sharp. Now, it's true that that what we were seeing was a 4K DCP, digital cinema package, which is the computer file that has the movie. And it has a native 4K resolution, and it's being projected in 4K. You add that to the greater sense or perception of detail with high dynamic range, and the detail, to me, it was just jaw-dropping. It was amazing.
Yeah. So I'm so jealous. I now got to rush out and go see this.
It starts tomorrow, man.
Yeah, I know, and hopefully in some other, they'll have some other major markets that will be able to show the HDR stuff as well too. So not everybody's in Los Angeles or in this area, and I know
Exactly.
Dolby does have a plan to expand this as much as they can into the theatrical world as well, and also into the home. So this will be coming to your home television sets at some point in time. They just had that announcement about Fox delivering all of their new UHD TV in HDR. Yeah, a lot of acronyms there, but
yeah, right. I don't think I saw that. When did they make that announcement? Maybe it was during
they
my
made the
vacation.
announcement like two days ago. It came out over the wire,
okay.
at least on a couple of the Hollywood trade magazines. So that's
Right.
gonna really give another push towards getting HDR out to the home for everybody.
Yeah. I'm just looking up on AVS Forum now. I posted a list of all the laser illuminated projector theaters in the country, around the world, actually. I'm not finding it immediately, but you're right that Dolby wants to get this out to a wider public. And in fact, aside from LA, there are 3 other locations, and somebody in the chat room reminded me of one of them. Kansas City, Missouri has one called the Berry Woods 24, I believe. There's also one in Atlanta, Georgia, which is pretty interesting. And
you would think New York City, or up in the around in that area, Boston might have one. That would be awesome.
Actually, that will be available. That will be ready for Inside Out, for the second movie, for the Pixar movie. It won't be. It's not going to be online for Tomorrowland, apparently. And the fourth one is the Deerbrook 24 in Houston, Texas.
Oh, wow. So if you're not getting flooded in Texas,
yeah, right.
If you can take your canoe and boat on over there to the theater. Sorry,
exactly.
I apologize. The poor people.
Yeah, well, it's a terrible thing. Yeah, and we certainly, our hearts go out to them. Absolutely. But yeah, Houston, Texas, Kansas City, Missouri, Atlanta, Georgia, and Hollywood, California. Those are the 4 places that you can go see this Tomorrowland in high dynamic range. Any place else you see it will be a version that has been regraded down to a 16-foot Lambert Peak White standard dynamic range. Should still look great, but not anywhere near what you can see in a true high dynamic range setting. So if you live in one of those cities or close enough to drive, it's well worth the drive. And somebody in the chat room here, Muchacho here, said, maybe this will bring folks out of the living room and back into the theater. And I think for the first time in a long time, there is a reason to go out to the movies, because at the moment, you can't see this in your living room. As you said, soon you will be able to. But at the moment, you can't.
Yeah, you can't. And the other thing that you got to remember is that you need a really dark surround, we call it, which the theater gives you. Yes, you can close all the curtains at your home and do all that kind of stuff and make that simulated dark surround. But this is what's going to give you that extra contrast down in the black area and the shadow detail we talk about, which is really what gets me most excited about HDR. The other thing that's interesting is the next one that comes out, Inside Out, all is computer animated. Now, in computer animation, you have a lot better handle over creating and generating these images. So when you go and shoot a live action, of course, you're taking a camera out in the field, and you've got, the environment, the weather, the stages, all these kind of things that you're fighting against to try to capture really good images. And so you're going to be a little bit limited in what you can get when you go out and get things. But when you're creating an animated show, anything can go. So it's really going to be exciting to see the difference as well between high dynamic range in animation versus high dynamic range in live action.
Yeah, exactly right.
Both of these should be spectacular. So hopefully, if there's a chance you can get out and see this, I really think this is the next wave and where it's going and where it really needs to go.
Yes, because as you said, we've now got UHD, Ultra HD TVs and 4K in the theater, but the number of pixels is really not nearly as important as this high dynamic range, because depending on how large the screen is and where you're sitting, how close you're sitting to it, you may very well not see a significant difference in perceivable detail between a 2K image and a 4K image. But with high dynamic range, you can see that clear across the room, easy, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things I think that even grandma's going to be able to tell, because it's that compelling of a difference between a standard dynamic range content that we've had now and the new high dynamic range that we're looking to and moving out in the future. You know, we've had constraints in television for the longest time, and in theater for that matter, of how much light we could pump through things and how much contrast we could get. And so now this is kind of opening up and pulling the bumper pads off, if you will, to get us to this kind of really exciting new place of wide dynamic range. And it's not just in the luminance. I mean, a lot of people kind of go directly to, well, it's the brightness, but it's not just brightness by itself. It's also the contrast. So it's the range that you have, not just that you have a very top end brightness as well too.
Right, exactly right. Certainly in this movie that I saw, the blacks were way, way deeper than any lamp-based projector I've ever seen. And including, though, you could see a lot of detail in the darker parts of the image. Plus, you can see that detail in the darker parts of the image. And if there's some bright part of the image, I think there's one shot at least where you're inside a room, but there's a door or a window, and you can see everything outside just as easily and well and balanced as you can on the inside. That's the real trick of HDR that you can't do now.
Yeah. It's really amazing thing. And the cameras are getting better. I mean, we've gone from the early days of digital cameras, which were more news ENG gathering type of cameras, which had very limited dynamic range, you know, down to 8 to 10 stops, which was kind of compressed, basically, is what you'd had to do, to the new cameras like the Sony F65 and the Arri Alexa. You know, these cameras have 14 stops of usable dynamic range now. So those cameras getting better. And film has always had fantastic dynamic range. So you can even take the old films out of the library if you have a really good negative, and then pull more stuff out of them to re-release into this new HDR world. So all of this stuff leaves a lot of potential for both catalog titles and, you know, new content going forward.
You know, that's an interesting point, because before the show started, I got a comment in the chat room or a question about whether or not high dynamic range would benefit older black and white movies. And at the time, I sort of said, well, maybe not, but maybe so, based on what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of that old nitrate film that was shot way back when had extremely good contrast and dynamic range built into it. And film has always been a wonderful medium. I mean, I'm still a lover of film, and you know, it's a little sad to see it kind of getting into the weaning years of its life. But that means that we can go back to those catalog titles, providing it was shot well and taken care of well, and eke out all that original dynamic range that those prints and those negatives had. So that's also going to provide a lot more material to go out and feed the pipeline.
Now, you say you're a fan of film, and that's very interesting to me. We hadn't talked about this before the show, but I'd love to touch on it for a minute, because I think, well, I'm pretty sure that over 90% of the theaters in the U.S. anyway are digital, and a lot of movies are being shot digitally. The Tomorrowland was shot on the Sony F65 and F55, which, as you say, have 14 stops of usable dynamic range, which helps make this movie possible in high dynamic range. But there are a few people in Hollywood, directors, Chris Nolan maybe one, I'm trying to remember now, J.J. Abrams possibly, who really, really, really like to shoot with film. And they've even gone so far as to petition the studios to buy film stock from Kodak, from their last remaining film manufacturing facility, so that film doesn't die completely. Are you in that camp?
Well, I grew up with film. You know, I'm an old fart. So when I first started working this stuff, you know, I started television first and then moved into the film transfer for library titles and all that kind of stuff. So I have a very deep passion for film and what film can do. And film has been a process that has worked so well for 100 years and continues to kind of get better and better as it goes on. The sad thing is that it's expensive to manufacture, it's expensive to make prints, and it's expensive to get the processing done as well. And
not to mention shipping reels, not to mention shipping. Well, you're not going to even if you shoot on film, you're not going to ship film.
You're not going to ship the reels, right? Exactly. But the tough part is that, you know, and the downside of film is a chemical process, and because of that, it has chemical byproducts and it has chemical waste and things that are not so nice for the environment. And also it has some things that are a little bit slower in the workforce. You have to turn this, you have to process the negative, you have to make a print, and then you can see it the next day or scan it and do all that kind of stuff. So it has some detriments, but a lot of advantages. And it was a long time before the digital world, both on the camera capture side and on the display side for theater and for the home, that is really just starting to now catch up with film. The tough part, and I applaud the directors for applying to the studios to keep film around. That's one part of the puzzle. The other part is who's going to process it, and how many processing plants do we have left that actually develop film? And those
Very few,
are falling,
I would think. Yeah.
they're falling by the wayside very fast. So it's one thing to have the film stock. It's another thing to get it processed after it's all done.
Right.
So unfortunately, the days will run out where we're going to go to a full digital world. Just due to the advantages, and also I think due to the fact that the technical quality of it will come up to the point where it needs to be. But there's always going to be people that have a love and a passion for film and will stay with film, and I have a soft spot in my heart for film and always will.
Well, what are the advantages? What is it about film that makes it so appealing? Is it the grain? Is it the look somehow of it?
I think it really comes into the thing of the HDR. It has had that dynamic range for a long time, more than any other camera does. So first of all, it had wide latitude, wide dynamic range to capture it. The other thing is it was designed so well way back in the day by Eastman Kodak to really adapt, or was designed to match the human visual system. So the way that it has its transfer function, the way it deals with the colors from black to white in a chemical analog process, really matches the way our brains see and pick up images. So that's why I think, and along with the feel of grain and the speed at 24 frames, it's something that we've all kind of grown accustomed to and grown up with. We've really adapted to that. Now there's a theory out there and discussion where, okay, if the kids now aren't watching film, they're watching things on the computer all the time, will they prefer film or not prefer film? And I think that's just a debate that will go on forever. But I think that's a big part of it, nostalgia. And it's a physical medium. A lot of people, like us creatives, you used to sit down on a bench and you'd physically cut film and splice it and put it together. And there was some speed and things that got used to doing that. And it's very portable. When you go out to shoot with film, you take some batteries, you take your film, and you can climb to the top of Mount Everest. Now if you're taking these sophisticated digital cameras, especially in the early days, and trying to trump up to the top of Mount Everest, well, what if something just gets jarred and breaks? You're dead. So film has been very reliable as well, and that was a big part of it for the people that were shooting things.
Dr. Morbius in the chat room is asking, can't they just create the same level of HDR in digital images?
Yes, and I think we're getting very, very close to that. It really has to do with two ends of the pipeline. Everything in the middle is fine, and this is why I say that animation has it easy to a certain extent, because they can just tap in the code values and get high dynamic range out. But on the live action side, you've got two things in the way. One is the sensor. That is the digital sensor that's picking up the photons and turning it into digits and electronic type of signals that go through the process. And the other side is the display. The display, being digital, has to be able to have a certain contrast ratio and be able to support high dynamic range. And the sensors have improved greatly. The displays have been a lot tougher to get up to that in the digital realm I'm talking about, to get that kind of contrast. And now with new Dolby Vision and Christie working on it, they've actually got that contrast ratio on the display side where it needs to be. Now it's the other side of it on the cameras. Can we eke out some more dynamic range on the camera side of capturing to really match what these new displays like the Dolby Vision are coming out with, and some of the new TVs like the OLEDs and things like that. So these are the two ends of the spectrum that we really have to do more development and kind of work on increasing the level. And I think right now it was flopped. It used to be the cameras, like I said, and then it was the displays that were way behind. I think now with the new displays, especially lasers, that now it's flopped and it's back to the camera side to kind of get up to speed a little bit. But it's coming so close to film anymore that I would doubt that anyone, if we did a side-by-side or especially a sequential where you show one image and then another image and we cut it back and forth between, film and HDR digital, that most people would not really notice the difference between the two. Some of us nitpicky people that stare at images all day long will be able to see the differences because we know where to look at and look for things. But
right.
It's up to the point now, I think, where there's less of an argument. It's similar to 35 millimeter still cameras to a certain extent. I don't think you can find analog film much anymore, and analog cameras. I mean, they're out there, but most of the professionals, I think, are all using digital cameras now in the still photography world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This whole discussion also reminds me of vinyl.
Yeah.
A little bit, and analog audio recording versus digital audio recording. And you mentioned the youngsters who are watching most of what they watch on computers or tablets or smartphones or whatever. They are also seemingly gravitating back a bit towards vinyl. And I find that very interesting about whether or not it's because of some quality issue that the people who go back to vinyl or who have always been with vinyl really like. I myself am not a vinyl person because I don't like the hassle of having to keep the record clean, and the turntables are generally can be very expensive. They don't always have to be, but they often are. Very much less convenient than digital formats, even like CD. What kind of parallels do you see there?
Well, as humans, we're analog people, right? So everything that we see and we hear comes in an analog world. And I always joke around that, someday my son's going to come up to me and go, "Hey, Dad, we discovered this new thing at the university. It's called analog, and it kicks the crap out of your digital stuff." Yeah, okay, maybe that'll happen. But, I got to tell you, for me, especially in the music side of it, and I'm a musician on the side, I've been playing loud rock and roll guitar too much. I can't hear the difference between vinyl and CD and MP3s anymore. So to me, it's about convenience, about having all my songs on the computer and be able to play them back and, play them loud in the truck and all that kind of stuff that I do. But it is a good point. Analog is closer to what we do every day as humans. Digital slices and dices this stuff up and then turns it back into analog so we can consume it, either making light photons or making sound pressure waves that we can hear through our ears. So in the end, it's got to be analog. And maybe if we get cleaner analog systems, this thing will all go 360 and digital will be passe. And like I said, we'll be back to analog again.
Right.
But I got to tell you, being an engineer, analog circuitry and design is so much harder than digital design, if you ask me, because that's where the magic really happens. And some of these guys, like radio waves are analog, and modem signals that go down wires are analog as well too. So those guys that know how to deal with those things are really the true awesome geeks, if you ask me.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always maintained that analog electronics, good high quality analog electronics, are always going to be expensive. Whereas good, high-quality digital electronics come down in price as you're able to stamp out 1 million chips of a particular design. Once you've got that design done and it works and it's good, you can stamp out 1 million of them and the product becomes less expensive. Whereas with good analog, it's always going to be expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And digital is so repeatable. So with digital, the beauty of it, and it may be the detriment as well too, is it's always going to be the same over and over and over again. It's going to be repeatable. Now it may be repeatably bad, but at least it'll be repeatable.
Right, exactly. Creamy Corncob in the chat room is saying, I think vinyl is coming back because people are learning about digital compression. That's a kind of another subject that we can talk about for another day, but he makes a good point. MP3s can sound pretty bad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And compression is the way that we're able to fit a lot of the stuff into the pipelines that we have to get it out into distribution. So MP3, H.264, MPEG-2, all of these things are designed to pack more bits into a small pipe and get it out to the other end and then decompress it again. And they try to take advantage of the human both auditory system and visual system and match it as close as they can. But some of the early compression stuff, it is what it is. It was designed, MP3 was designed, 10, 15 years ago, maybe more.
Even more, yeah.
Even more. So our algorithms on compression have got much better. We understand more about the hearing systems and the visual systems to try to adapt the compression to take advantage of those things. For example, humans don't see color as well as we might like to think we see color. We see black and white better than we see color. So that's why you have a lot of compression systems that drop off the resolution in color because humans don't really generally see that. So this is a way to kind of compress things, if you will, to get it out to the
without affecting the quality too tremendously.
Right. Too tremendously, yeah. So it won't be noticeable basically by the normal human person. So.
Well, you mentioned a while ago talking about film frame rate and the fact that we've used 24 frames per second in movies for the last 100 years.
Well, actually, we've used it for the last 80 years, because I think the first 20 years in silent films, it was about 16 to 18 frames. So there's been, it was how fast can you crank that knob?
Right.
That's how fast the capture frame rate was. And playback, they would try to match it as best they can. But
man,
exactly.
What a nightmare that must have been.
Yeah, well, nobody really noticed, although people kind of moved a little bit faster if you projected it a little bit too quick. But that's one of the things, the early things that SMPTE did was to standard that at 24 frames per second. And really? It was the advent of sound that came in that mandated that frames had to be consistent and played back consistent. Otherwise, your sound would warble up and down. So that's really why we came up with the standard of 24 frames per second, was really to be able to put sound on the side of film and get that to play back, the same way each time. So, and I guess we've gotten used to it.
And we have. I was always under the impression that 24 frames per second was chosen because it was the slowest rate at which the image didn't look jerky, and the studios and everybody wanted to save money on film, which was expensive. And the faster you ran it through the camera and the projector, the more film you used, and so the more money you were spending. So that was the urban legend or urban myth, shall we say, of why we made it to 24, made 24 the standard. But more recently, I heard something about having to do with audio, and I can't remember exactly what that was.
So both of those myths, if you will, and they're not really myths, are true, because yes, boy, as I've dug into the history of film in the 1900s, wow, you talk about the competitiveness between companies and the way to try to make more money. If you ran the film slower, you could put more film in the machine and have a longer program. So that was an interest, is how slow could we go? So we wouldn't have to build up really big film reels and try to ship those around. The other thing, too, is the mechanical shutters that go in front of film. So every time you show a frame of film, you run a shutter in front of it, and then you show the same film frame again, and then you put the shutter in back of it again, and then you move to the next frame, and then you open it up and show the shutter. That's called a two-bladed shutter in projection, and it kind of goes round and round and round. There's also a three-bladed shutter, which they finally got to, that would show the film 3 times with the shutter going around before it moves to the next frame.
Each frame they would show 3 times.
Exactly.
Partly,
and
that was partly in order to disguise the fact, at least when the film was moving, disguise the fact that it was going from one frame to the next, right?
Yeah, that was one of the things that they had to blanket when they did that to move the film, so that it wouldn't show blur when it moves the film. But it basically, we're susceptible to flicker, and flicker is lights. I'm sure you've seen it. If you take the light switch and jack it up and down, it looks like flicker. Well, in order for that light to be not have flicker, we have to get that up to at least 48 times a second to the human eye. And it can go less than that. PAL video is about 50 frames. 48 we're kind of okay with. If you get below 48, we start noticing a strobing or a flicker effect. And so at 24 frames, that's not enough to get rid of the flicker. That's why they put the blades in front of it, as well as to move the film in between the frames as it went through the gate. And so these things are stuff we did to get the feel, and that's what is in film. The other thing in film that's really interesting is every time that gate opens, man, that film kind of gets a blast of light, which makes it go out a little bit and then come back in and land into the gate. So it goes a little bit out of focus right when it gets its first blast of light when the gate comes on, and then it kind of smooths down and then goes down again. So, and then also it kind of rocks in the pins in the gate. And so the thing of it is all that stuff your brain kind of takes away and doesn't see at all. But they couldn't run these films faster than 24 frames because all of that mechanics would be very difficult to not kill and break and rip film. There was a lot of experiments in the early days getting it up to 48 and 60 frames per second in some things, and even large format that was done right around 1906. So all of this stuff is not new. It's been around for a long time, but now we're having the technique and the qualities to be able to do more of this high frame rate stuff. And so now we can do it. Now the question is, should we do it? So that's the next question.
That was my next question. In fact, you have anticipated it beautifully, because now one of the things that we're talking about in addition to high dynamic range in this brave new video world is high frame rate. And we've seen now 3 Hobbit movies with 48 frames per second, twice the normal rate per eye in those cases because they were 3D. James Cameron has talked about doing 48 and even 60 frames per second. Doug Trumbull, famous special effects guy, his show scan technology went up to 60, I think.
60 frames per second, yep. Right.
Yep. And now I've even seen some examples at 120.
Yeah, so now he's shot a recent film that was done at 120 frames per second. And what he's been able to do, and this is where it's kind of exciting. So to talk about high frame rate, again, we need to break it into 2 pieces. One, you have the camera side, and that's the capture. What frame rate are you capturing at? And we usually call that the temporal side of the capture. And then what frame rate do you display it at? And these don't have to be the same. So you can capture, for example, and this is what Doug Trumbull's been talking about, and what we ran some experiments with at Disney as well too, is why don't we capture at a high frame rate, 120 frames per second, and then we can electronically process out to any frame rate we want for the display side, be it 24, be it 48, be it 60, for example. And if you do it in multiples, it's a little bit easier to combine the frames. And then there's also one other thing that affects the frame rate in the capturing side of things, and that's, again, the shutter that's in the camera. Either a mechanical shutter that goes around and exposes the sensor for a certain amount of time within that 24th of a second, or it's an electronic shutter that shuts down the scaling of the chip, or not the scaling, but the intake of the chip in between its exposure time. And that has a very huge effect on the look of the images once it's displayed out, even at a high frame rate. And so there's been a lot of talk about, the soap opera effect, and it looks like TV, it doesn't look like film. And these are all kind of subjective descriptions about frame rate as it's been shown. But I think there's some exciting work that's being done by a couple of folks out there in the community to say, well, wait a minute, guys, Hobbit was done at a 270-degree angle shutter, and it was shown at 48 frames per second, and it was shown 3D to the eye. What can we do that would maybe be more appealing to the eye by messing around with a shutter? And so this is, again, what Doug Trumbull's done. The shutter angle. So then again, this is what Doug Trumbull is also working on, is he's capturing at a very high frame rate with a wide open shutter. So the shutter never shuts down. It just captures all the frames it can. And then in the process of the frames in the back end in post-production, you can use different algorithms to simulate shutters to create your next frame rates back on the other side. And so I think this opens up a whole new area of discovery for the creative community and the engineering community to say, okay, maybe it doesn't have to look like soap opera. Maybe it can look like something different. In fact, we also found that you can make kind of hyper real looking stuff, especially if you have a very short shutter angle that's only exposed for a certain amount of time. That leaves you no motion blur, outside. If you have a wide shutter angle that's open and exposes an image across the sensor for a long period of time, anything that's in motion will have a blur content that comes off the backside of that. And we've gotten used to that. Humans are used to seeing kind of blurring objects or fast moving objects as blurred items. So, in animation, they actually create blur and put it in there so it looks more natural when they're doing things. So
isn't that interesting?
It's a combination of all these things put together that can make the images look and feel differently to the audience. And so that's something that I think is exciting, that we can get to these places. The other side of the equation is on the display side. Now, television.
Wait, hang on 1 second. Before you go to the display side, there's a graphic that I want to show that you provided me, and I'd hate to miss it.
Oh, sure.
Two of them actually. One is called HFR I think it's called HFR. It's that one. And
Yeah,
here we
there you
can
go.
see here we can easily see, you know, the number of frames that are shot in 1 second. And on
Right.
the
So,
left you have 24, and on the right I guess you have 48, twice as many.
right. So the basic thing here that it's demonstrating, and this can be either on the capture side of it or on the display side of it, is within 1 second. Generally, we've had 24 frames per second, and that's been the standard for the last 80 some odd years. And now we're able to cram in more frames into that same space of a second. So now you can see you've got double the amount of frames here if you're shooting at 48 frames per second or displaying at 48 frames per second. So this can really help smooth the motion. It also gives you an increased resolution as well, too, because you've got more frames and more pixels coming at you at that same time period as you had before with just 24 frames per second. So now if you
greater temporal resolution, I would call it.
Exactly, greater temporal resolution, but it also gives you the impression that things are sharper. Things are, you know, actually, and this was the difference, if you will. You can notice it yourself that this is why 1280 720p at 60 frames per second broadcast by some broadcasters versus 1080i, which is interlaced at 60 fields per second, it looks pretty close to the same. You know, because you've got actually 60 true progressive frames versus an interlace where you've got really half the frames for one field and half the other half of the frame on the other field. So again, this increases kind of the resolution of things. So
exactly.
now
we do have a picture of a shutter angle thing too that I want to make sure we see.
Oh yeah.
Just to illustrate what you're talking about in terms of shutter angle, which as we can describe what we see here.
Yeah, so this is a mechanical shutter or a view of a mechanical shutter, and it shows the exposure time versus the non-exposure time as it goes around in front of a sensor. So the sensor would be behind this, or if this was actually in a projector, you know, the light would be behind it and would shine through. And this shows what we talk about in degrees of shutter: 180 degrees, 90 degrees, 45, 15. And you can see the smaller numbers, of course, the amount of time that there's exposure onto your sensor or your film frame is very limited, right? So generally, if you have a very sharp, and you go back to still photography, it's the same thing. You can really make sharp pictures, especially when things are in motion. As you open up the shutter more from 180 to 270 to 360, if you will, then you're going to expose longer for that single frame than you would normally in the other way. And so film has always been traditionally 24 frames per second with a 180-degree shutter. That's been the normal for a very, very long point in time. Now we have the capability with the digital cameras to play around with that shutter angle and capture at things like 273, 90 degrees, 45, and change that. In film cameras, we had the same ability to a certain extent, but with digital, it gives us a much wider range to mess around with it.
And the shorter shutter angles mean sharper images in each frame because there's less motion. If there's something in motion, it's less blurry. Exactly. But it also gives the counterpoint to that, as I recall, is it's easier for the image to look kind of stuttery, even at high frame rates.
Yeah, it makes it very stroby looking. So it looks like it's strobing at you or flickering to a certain extent. And so it's amazing if you want to grab stuff out of there, especially for visual effects. But again, for humans, it looks a little odd to us. It looks pretty stroby to a certain extent. So, and if you slow it down, and you leave the shutter open and you go the other direction, then it starts to look very laggy because things are just kind of, you got blur across a lot of different images. So those are the two extremes by messing around with the shutter on the pickup side of things, on the capture side.
Right, exactly. And then you were about to talk about the display side.
Yeah, on the display side now with the new DLP chips and with other type of manufacturers, they can refresh or redisplay things on their side very, very quickly, quicker than mechanical stuff has ever been able to do in the past. So, if you had to run film at 60 frames per second in the mechanical world, you'd have to speed up the mechanics of the thing to run that. And it just kind of beats up the film like crazy. But with digital, it's just a matter of flashing those, DLP mirrors, if you will, in a DLP design quicker and quicker. And they've got to flash so quick anyway. So it really takes care of that. So now you have the ability to display things that, TVs always come with 240 hertz kind of displays on the back end. I turn it off every time I can because I don't like that. I don't like the look of what it does to it takes movies to me and makes them look like TV.
Exactly. But this is not a good thing to do. But no, it's not. I agree. But this is the question. These TVs are taking the incoming frames, which are real information, and then duplicating them and synthesizing new frames in between. How do you see that as opposed to capturing at a higher frame rate and displaying it at a higher frame rate? Is that going to be better ultimately, or is it still going to take on that soap opera effect?
No, I think it's much better. So there's two different things to really pay attention to. One is called a refresh rate, and one is called the frame rate. Now, the frame rate is exactly how many frames were captured, say 60, and then how many do you display 60. Now, you can take that 60, just like we were talking about mechanical film, and you can display each frame once, twice, 3 times. That's the refresh rate. That's how many times do I take one frame and refresh it to you on a display system, right? So that's the difference between refresh and actual frame rate. In our television broadcast, at least here in America, we've always been watching either 60 fields per second or 60 frames per second lately. It's actually 59.94. That's a whole other issue about fractional frame rate.
That's a whole fractional frame rate.
Which we could spend, a lot of time on.
We could spend a whole show on just that, but let's not.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is, the refresh is only just refreshing one single frame back to you. And certain TVs have that in there because it makes the panel work better to a certain extent.
And you can turn off the frame interpolation, and the TV will then still display each frame so many number of times before the next.
Many number of times, right. So there's knobs you can twist in there to get it to look to kind of the way you want. But again, the key thing is the refresh versus the frame rate. Now, we should be showing the frames exactly as they were captured at the same frame rate and not messing too much with the refresh rate if we don't have to. That would be the most optimum. So if you really want to have smooth, high-quality pictures, you'd want to capture them at a high frame rate, 120 frames per second, for example, and display them at exactly 120 frames per second as well, too. This would give you the optimum experience of 120 frames all the way through, if you like that look of 120 frames. It's going to look closer and closer to reality. And I think there's been some studies done by the BBC. They're really recommending we should be at 300 frames per second. So, but I think we're going to have to wait a bit before we get to that, especially.
Well, and you're right. We can, I guess, shoot at 120. I mean, Doug Trumbull has done it. The Sony cameras might do it. I'm pretty sure the Red cameras do it. The Aries might do it.
Most all cameras these days, professional cinematography cameras, do at 120. Some reduce the resolution to do 120. The F55, I know, goes up to 240 frames per second, I think, as well, too. Some of that is done for slow-mo. So some of that you capture really high frame rate, and then you play it back at a normal speed, and it's slow motion. And we use that quite a bit. I call it speed warping. You do both ways. Sometimes we do time-lapse. That's the other side of the equation. And then you've got, high frame rate capture. You play back at slow-mo. But HFR is really kind of talking about high frame rate capture, high frame rate display. So we get it more closer to what probably reality would be.
Right, exactly. Well, in the 12 minutes or so we have left, I wanted to ask you about your own directorial work. You've made two short films, both of which had some very interesting experimental techniques that you used in them regarding what we've been talking about on the show. So tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, absolutely. So while I was at Disney, I got the great fortune of directing a experimental film that we did to test out a new camera. It was a trifocal camera system, and it was a joint effort that was done with both the Fraunhofer Institute, HHI in Berlin, as well as ARI. And the design and the goal was, can we get a better way to shoot stereoscopic content, to shoot 3D without having a standard stereoscopic rig? So can we have someone go out and shoot a movie and supplement it with extra side small cameras that then could pick up the 3-dimension or the
parallax.
The parallax, if you will, and then in the post-production process, then create your stereoscopic at that point in time, where you have a lot more control.
We actually have a picture of that trifocal camera we can show.
There it is. Yeah, there's the beauty before we went out and shot it. So that's the pristine one that we had in the lab, and then by the time you get it out on the set and you put everything else on it, thing looks like a monster. But it's a prototype, and this was an experimental film that was done to basically shoot with this camera, shoot like you're going to shoot a 2D movie, and then in the post-production where you have a lot more control creating stereo, make a stereo 3D movie. So it was a little movie called Make Believe, and it was shot in Berlin, and I think it was around 2012 that we shot it over there, and brought it back and made a complete little short film that turned out to be a wonderful little film about a kind of a quirky science girl that gets laughed at by her classmates, and finally in the end she kind of shows them that science is pretty cool because she discovers a new planet up in the sky. So
wow.
Little thing called Make Believe, and so we learned a lot. And it was really the forerunner.
Can you see that anywhere?
Sorry. It was an experimental film that was done, and nobody has any plans, as far as I know, to release it, which is a shame because I think it'd be a great thing to get out to the audience, but maybe someday that'll change. But it was the baby step to something we call computational cinematography. And this is where you can use camera arrays now instead of a single camera. Think of multiple small little cameras to start capturing light fields, if you will.
Right, and we have a picture of that kind of an array as well. It's called Fraunhofer array.
Yeah, Fraunhofer. Yeah, Fraunhofer. Siegfried Fussel and Frederick Zilli are the guys that are working on this at the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany at Erlangen. And this is their design, where you can see 6 cameras here that are all on their little small cameras that are recording at the same time. This allows you to pull out the depth information from a scene. It allows you to refocus shots after the fact by having what's called synthetic aperture. You can also stitch all the cameras together to get high resolution, and you can also work with the input f-stops and get high dynamic range at the same time. So this is very, very early days of stuff, but it really is kind of where things are going to. Instead of having one big, large sensor to try to capture new, higher resolution, everything else, they're really experimenting with these multiple small camera systems and camera arrays. And it's very exciting stuff.
It's great that it's called computational cinematography, because you're doing a lot of computation on the back end in post-production.
Right. So the idea is, and this scares a lot of the directors of photography, and I don't blame them to a certain extent. But the idea was you would go out into the woods, and you'd have your truck put up the big camera array. You put the actors in front. You do the scene, and you fold it down, and you go back, and you actually create the images in post-production, using the algorithms and rendering that has become so ubiquitous now on the back end. It's a little scary because, you can kind of see what you've got, but you're really making your images now on the back end. The beauty is, though, you have so much more control. Like you said, you could refocus, you could do zoom ins, you could relight some things. There's a lot of different things that you can do with this. But it's going to take some time, both for the creative community to get their head around it, and for the systems to get up to speed. Now, having said that, virtual reality has to have multiple cameras. So already VR is pushing the envelope of these camera arrays. They just do it in a different place because they put them around in a circle, around to get a 360 or a sphere, and so it shoots down, it shoots above, and things like that. So you're going to see, I think, a lot more of these camera arrays coming into use, starting with VR, of course, and then moving into maybe even regular production at some point in time.
Well, you and I were talking about virtual reality a bit before the show, and that's a seriously scary thing for creatives, I think, because suddenly the audience has the option of looking around, and not everybody will see the same thing.
Yeah, all as directors, we're kind of egomaniacs. We want you to look exactly where we want you to look. It's a passive experience, right? And now, so I got a beautiful love scene going on in a VR thing, and there's some bird up in the sky. And instead of looking at the lovers, you're looking up at the bird going, will he fall out or not?
So our engineer, John, found a picture of the trifocal camera out in the field. Let's take a look at that. That is...
There it is. There's
as
you
say, the monster.
The monster, yeah. So of course it's prototype, and we've got everything hanging off cameras, when we do go out and shoot. So there's displays up there. There's an extra recorder. We had to have some synchronization boxes strapped onto the whole thing. So yeah, it was a little bit of a beast to move around. But oddly enough, we had a fantastic guy. One of the mandates was to get this onto a Steadicam rig. And we had a fantastic guy that actually, saved my butt, if you will, because we were running out of time. That put this rig or the other. We had two cameras, the other rig onto a Steadicam, and actually manipulated the Steadicam around. He actually had one shot where he was on a Segway with the Steadicam and got a gorgeous shot that's in the movie. Wish people could see that, but
wow, I wish so too.
Out.
Actually,
yeah.
I'd love to see it myself. Tell us a little bit about the other short you made called Emma.
So the other short is Emma. It's an HDR short. We were intended to shoot it in HDR from the very start. When we were a little bit early, we shot this last year in May, and we used the Arri Alexa camera again. And Darren Nakata was the DP, did a fantastic job in shooting it. But it's kind of an Alfred Hitchcock tone thriller, if you will, a short film about 13 minutes that's just made it to Cannes. We're so happy.
Good luck at Cannes.
Got the screen over there, and so we're really excited. My producing partner is on the beach and the yachts in Cannes, and I'm sitting here in California in gray skies. But
well, we're honored to have you with us. Yes.
Yeah. Nonetheless, it was shot intentionally. It's done on a dark, scary night, and it is shot intentionally to have this kind of rainy, dark, scary feel. It's a little bit of a ghost story to a certain extent, and we thought, and I really wanted to shoot this in HDR because of the shadow detail that went along with it. So we
have
shot
a picture. We have a still from that actually, which won't show much of the shadow detail, but you can get a look.
Show much of it, but you can get an idea of why we use HDR to shoot this. And so the beauty is that we want to hold the lights in the top of this thing in dynamic range, and we want to be able to see the shadow detail on the bottom of it, basically down toward the stairs or at the bottom. And so this is a beautiful house that's here in right above Atwater Village. It's the Heritage Museum where we shot over 2 nights to put this little movie together. It's a little thriller thing.
In Los Angeles, yeah.
In Los Angeles, yeah, in Los Angeles. So it's and it turned out fantastic. We did some test grading in HDR. We had one grade done in HDR, but again, we did it in the very, very early days. I would like to go back and get another HDR grade on it. And, once we get done with the festival circuit run that we're doing, then we can start getting it out into distribution. So we're trying to protect our festivals so we can get screenings. They have premiere requirements and things like that. So.
Well, that's a good question. How did you do the HDR grading a year ago? When or more, whatever it was, it seems to me that you would need an HDR monitor to do the grading, and that's a pretty rare thing even today.
Yeah, it is rare, and this is the toughest thing that we have at the moment, especially for independent filmmakers, is getting a hold of these displays and be able to color correct on them. I actually got the opportunity to color correct this in Arri's post-production unit in Munich. They had one of the earlier prototype Dolby Vision monitors.
Wow.
We graded on one of the the early prototypes that they had at the time, and that's how we graded that basically. And then we did another pass with Dolby down here in Hollywood on the big screen to do a demonstration. We graded about the first 4 minutes of the program in order to see it on that early Dolby Vision projector that actually is showing Tomorrowland. So we were there in the kind of the early days of that stuff as it went on. So.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I will Emma get any kind of distribution? I hope so.
I sure hope so. Anybody out there, please. Love to do that. We're independent, and it was totally self-funded, and now we're trying to get it out there in the public and make sure people can see it and see if it can get some traction. But again, I'd love to have another opportunity to get another HDR grade on it. And the problem we have at the moment is that every display, we've got different HDR systems.
This is a problem, isn't it?
This is a problem because every HDR display needs a different color correction pass at the moment to really optimize your content for that screen. And so, if it's a closed ecosystem and there's only one person out there doing it, that's all good and wonderful and things will look great. But as we get more and more manufacturers and more people that want to do HDR, we're going to have some standards. And so this is where SMPTE is kind of playing into the part. They've got an HDR study group, which I'm a part of, and a lot of people in the industry are a part of, that working towards, okay, guys, let's get our stuff together here, because we're going to have to share. Not one person can own this all the way through. So we better come up with some standards so we can share content between it and make it look reasonably well the way the filmmakers, had designed it to look, both in the studio and in the theater itself and at home.
Well, I sure agree that standards are critical, and I'm concerned, as you are, with the fact that there's Dolby Vision, there's Technicolor's got an HDR system, BBC, Philips. There are several different ones out there. And
yeah, everybody's now. It's the race is on.
yeah, unbelievable.
Who has the right transfer function and who's going to win for that standard? And this is one of the things that, I applaud all the companies that jumped in early and that had started doing this work, because you need that to get this thing off the ground. And now it's kind of in its teenage years where, okay, we know we can do this. We know it's really positive. We want it to look good. Now we're going to have to do the hard work of settling down and making some compromises to get everybody onto the same page, just like we did with digital cinema in the early days. So, and this is where I think SMPTE does its best work. SMPTE gets those people together in a room, just like it did back in the 1900s, to have everybody agree upon what 35 millimeter film was going to be and how far the sprocket holes and all those things were going to be, because they didn't agree in those days either. There was a whole bunch of proprietary people running out there to try to own the world, if you will, especially Mr. Edison.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's there's some fantastic stories of those early days. So now HDR is kind of going through the same thing, and UHD TV is okay. How do we, let's do some experiments. Let's see what we got. Let's learn what's really going to be the right approach for this stuff, and then let's start putting this stuff down on paper and getting people to agree.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're actually going to talk about that next week, and I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But for the last minute or two here of this show, I'd love to have you tell us about your current project, which is directing a documentary about the 100-year history of SMPTE.
Yeah, so this is a fantastic opportunity. I realized, it wasn't. About a couple of years ago, SMPTE started talking about its 100-year anniversary, which is coming up next year, actually, in 2016. And to celebrate that 100-year anniversary, a couple of things were talked about. What should we do to kind of mark this milestone? And one of them was, since we are the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, maybe we should have a documentary that shows SMPTE and its involvement over those 100 years and the different technology milestones that we've hit across the way. So when I knew that they might think about doing this, I probably chatted everybody's ear off, twisted every arm, and politicked my way as fast and hard as I could to be the director on this. And they were really nice enough to give me a shot at it. We shot for 5 days and then put together a small little trailer sizzle piece that we showed at NAB.
Which I saw, which looked really interesting.
Yeah, got very good response, and now we're kind of I'm back to reading and researching and writing again for the rest of it, and we'll go back out in July and start shooting again to finish it off for production at the end of this year. Get into post-production around the January timeframe and get it kind of finished up and ready for theatrical and distribution around the 100-year anniversary mark, which is around July, August. There's 2 dates in SMPTE that are the anniversaries. And so around that time, we should have this project done. And it's been just a sheer joy for me. First of all, I'm a geek. I love this stuff, and I've always been a fan of history. And to learn about all this stuff now that happened in the 1900s, stuff that happened in the event of sound when it came out, and how many studios didn't want sound at all. How things happen and turn there. That it went TV and the competition between TV broadcasters and film. The power of the computer coming in and the internet to these days, and now of course the expansion of UHD-TV and the melding of cinema and film and media and transmedia and all this kind of good stuff that's coming up. So it's a great project, and I only wish I had. They want it to fit into 90 minutes. I think I can fit it into 10 hours because it's just stuff. So I've already scared them and said my director's cut's going to be at least 3 hours. But
yeah, right.
I'm
are
sure
you shooting? Are you doing any shots in? I mean, you're doing a lot of archival footage, which is what it is. But are you doing any of the modern interview shots in high dynamic range or high frame rate or anything like that?
We talked about that, and it's mostly the stuff that we're going to shoot is going to be talking heads, like us.
Yeah.
Sitting
So
here.
what's the point? Yeah.
We call it talking heads. But what we did do is Canon was very, very kind to us and gave us 2 C500s. So we actually, along with Codex, which gave us the recorders to use, so we're actually shooting this in 4K. It's not in HDR. And it's not in high frame rate, but it is going to be in 4K. So we figured by the time 2016 comes along, there will be some UHD TV broadcast, and we want to be ready for that. So that is something that's interesting and painful, I must say. When you do a documentary, usually your ratios of finished, what you shoot to finished product, they're in the 200-to-1 series. So I run my calculations on how much data we're going to have at the end of this, and I think it's about 150 terabytes worth of raw footage we'll have.
Oh man! Well, so, that is that's one of the challenges of the digital age and digital movie making is, I mean, I've seen server farms at Sony and other places that are petabytes of data.
Yeah. No, we're into the petabyte region these days. So, they used to price out per gigabyte, and I think that's old hat. We need to price out per terabyte.
Right. Well, listen, we've come to the end of a fabulous hour. There's so much more we could talk about. Will you come back sometime after the movie, maybe? When the movie comes out, you could come back and you'll have a moment to breathe, and we can talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been fun, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope the listeners got something out of it.
Oh, I'm sure they did. I know I sure did. You can find out much more about SMPTE at SMPTE.org, where Howard does a lot of standards work and so on. Howard, is there any place else online that people can go and find your stuff?
Well, you could look up Panon Entertainment online. That's a website that leads to other things. We're pretty much for the filmmaking on the Facebook side. So if you look me up on Facebook or Emma the Movie, on Facebook as well too, you can find out more about us at Panon Entertainment.
Okay, very good. You can always find me, of course, at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott, also at avsforum. And you can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/htg. or on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twithometheatergeeks. As I mentioned briefly, next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Jim Hellman, the CTO of Movie Labs, who is also involved in the standards process at SMPTE. And we're going to be talking about the high dynamic range standard at SMPTE and other related issues. And I thank SMPTE very much for arranging for Howard to be on today and for Jim to be on next week. We might count it as a part 2, but in any event, it'll be more standardization and lots of very interesting stuff to talk about. So I do hope you will join us. Until then, geek out.